What's that? Who there? Whoa.
All right, guys, I've got Jeremy Kai, the co-founder and CEO of Italic here. Jeremy, welcome to the show. Thanks so much for doing this.
Thank you so much for having me. Really excited to be here.
Yeah, man, I'm stoked today. So I'm a massive fan of what you're doing at Italic and just yours in general. And so really looking forward to diving into it. So let's get right into it. I think where I like to start is, with your background a little bit. So you went to Babson, which is actually rated the number one entrepreneurship program in the country. And I know you eventually dropped out, and you actually wrote this really interesting piece on your website about how dropping out, is not always as glorified as the media would make it seem. So what I'd love for you to do is, can you just walk us through kind of your mentality in going to Babson for entrepreneurship, and then kind of what you wanted to get out of it and why you ultimately dropped out?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's not easy to answer fully. But I think ultimately, I went to Babson. To be honest, that number one in entrepreneurship thing, even though if you really like take an objective lens to it, like what does that really mean? Like how can you study, entrepreneurship? And they have classes for it, but generally speaking, that was what appealed to me. I grew up in a family where my parents were first generation immigrants, and they had over the years started a number of companies, most of which did not work out, but one finally did in manufacturing. And I think from a young age, that was really what I personally looked up to. So I think when it came to a college decision, we had a couple decent choices. I didn't get into all the, really fancy schools and all that, but Babson, I think that really won me over was the whole entrepreneurship spiel. But I think to the point of why I had left, I think ultimately it really came down to I think you can study something all day long, and especially in the case of like being a founder or building a business, you can study it in a classroom all you want, and there's great case studies that you can read over. You can think about how a leader made a decision or whatnot, and I think a lot of those skills are helpful. Mostly like the tactical ones being on finance and marketing and whatnot. But generally speaking, I think you have to ultimately kind of like pull the trigger and do it, which is ultimately why I had. But that was ultimately why I went to Babson, and ultimately why I had decided to leave. I have my parents are, I'm Asian. My parents are your classic stereotypical Asian parents, so it wasn't easy to convince them to leave. But one thing that did help was I did bring in a lot of credits over from high school, which was really helpful for Babson, which accepted those. But then more importantly, it kind of gave me a way to justify to my parents leaving for at least a semester or so, which allowed me to kind of go to San Francisco. I applied for maybe like at least 200 internships, and finally one said yes. And it was my chance at the time. This was back in like 2014, 2015, when I think like everyone wanted to go to San Francisco. So I think, or at least anyone who was like into tech wanted to get to SF. So I had a chance to make it out there. And then over there, I basically had to prove again to my parents to let me stay out of college. So, and even to this day, I think it's been maybe seven or so, a little over 7 years now. I'm still technically on a leave of absence. So really, the way I was able to justify it to my parents were like consecutively higher, not prestige points, if you will, but like doing things like Y Combinator, which back then was like this really prestigious. Oh well, no, it's even today. It's still a pretty prestigious, accelerator. I got the Teal Fellowship, which mandated that you drop out of college and stay out all these first 2 years, and they give you, money to do so. So I think ultimately I was able to kind of convince my parents, like, hey, let me do this and try to form my own path. But yeah, that's the quick story there.
Definitely. Yeah. And a couple things I definitely want to double click on. So the first is, let's dive into the Teal Fellowship. And I know this is kind of intertwined with you starting your previous company, which was called Foundation. I think at the beginning it was called Onboard IQ. But I'd love for you to just talk about, one of the things I love getting into with founders is the way they assess market opportunities, and like what is the unique insight that you saw that most people missed and why there was an opportunity for you to chase it. And so with Onboard IQ and then eventually Foundation, when you renamed it, what was that unique insight and why pursue that as your first company?
Yeah, so it was Fountain, like the it's
Oh,
a funny
Fountain,
name.
Fountain,
Yeah,
Fountain.
I think like when we first started, it was Keith, my co-founder, and I, and we're good friends to this day. So it wasn't like we had a weird falling out. which I think a lot of found. We actually it was your classic story of like starting a startup for the sake of it and not actually like knowing anything about the industry or anything about like what we were getting into. To be honest with you, and I think in many ways we were very lucky in that regard, where we Keith and I like we weren't like childhood friends. We had actually just met. There was a Facebook group at the time which was really popular called Hackathon Hackers. This is also the heyday of like hackathons being a big thing in colleges. Um, so I think we had met like literally 2 weeks prior. We were like, hey, let's start a company together. And the genesis was essentially I was working at a company. I was interning at a company called SHYP, which at the time was doing on demand kind of pickups and shipping. It was a great company. Really learned a lot there. And he was kind of a new grad and trying to figure out like a problem to tackle. And Keith was the CEO, so he was the one who kind of like first proposed the idea of at the time, the company was called, it wasn't even Onboard. It was before Onboard IQ, it was Onvard. And essentially, we observed the idea of like, hey, a lot of these applicant tracking systems, such as Lever, Greenhouse, so on and so forth, a lot of which at the time were just getting started, they were really focused on knowledge work. But from our time working at Ship and just like observing, just speaking to a lot of on-demand companies, which was back in 2014 and 2015, like a really, really big kind of part of the tech hype cycle, if you will. We noticed that a lot of these people were hiring, I guess like blue collar workers, and the way you hire and the way we screen for them when we were talking to these companies like was very, very different. And we thought it was an opportunity to build a company in that space. And kind of like that's how the idea came around. It was really a function of like, hey, here's a something that we know nothing about, and here's frankly speaking like nothing that we really cared too much about either. It was just like, let's build a company and see what happens. And everything kind of, again, we got very lucky in that regard, where we were able to like do all these things and hire the right people. But I think 9 times out of 10 you're not supposed to build a company that way. So yeah, we got lucky.
Yeah, that's great. And so at some point, right, you decided you were going to leave Fountain and then start Italic. And I'd love to get into what happened, where you saw that unique insight there. But before we dive into that, for people that don't know what Italic is, can you just give like the 2-minute summary of kind of the vision for it and how you go to market today?
Yeah. So the quick story of Italic is today a membership that provides access to over 1,000 products that we design and develop ourselves, ranging from cookware to apparel to accessories to bedding. Nowadays, even to active products such as like ski goggles and weight sets. And our spin on it is that we went and found the same manufacturers as high-end brands, but we don't really monetize the products very much. So we sell them at a price that is typically maybe 50 to 80% less than what leading direct-to-consumer brands would charge, and even more so compared to traditional incumbents. So that's kind of the consumer pitch. A lot of the actual work for Italic like happens underneath the hood. Like I mentioned, I come from a manufacturing family, and that I could go into the whole backstory there. But the most of our work and effort actually has been on the supply side, and really the kind of long-term vision of what we're trying to build is really a two-sided marketplace where we are the infrastructure and the pipeline that connects manufacturers directly to consumers around the world. And for manufacturers, we essentially want to empower them to become merchants of their own without having to take on a lot of the logistical, technical challenges of spinning up, let's say, their own brand. So, and then for consumers, hey, you can buy like really, really great quality, really well designed product, but at a fraction of the price point that so-called brands would charge. So yeah, that's a quick 2-minute summary on Italic.
Yeah. And so on your site, you have this really good breakdown, super simplified, but clear to understand, where you compare like the classic luxury retailer versus Italic. And you go through the steps of the process and really showcase that margin bloat and where it comes from. For people who are having trouble visualizing that, can you just run through like, when you completely disrupted, I would say, the luxury retail supply chain. So just give a highlight on that and why it's so powerful what you're doing.
Yeah, and I think I'd even take it one step further to say that I think for we started in so-called traditional luxury goods mainly because the value proposition is so obvious there, where one purchase you're going to save like hundreds of, if not sometimes even thousands of dollars in one transaction. But the supply chain is actually pretty common across like most consumer goods, aside from CPG, where like the multiples are a little bit, the margins a little bit thinner. But to put it in a very tangible example, let's say a manufacturer produces really great quality products for a range of high end clients, and let's say they make a shirt. Typically, a manufacturer margin is maybe 15 to 25% on top of cost of goods and labor. So let's say that shirt costs $16. In actuality, the manufacturer will take their margin, which might be, let's say, $3 to $5. So they might sell it to a brand for $20, but that brand will go and historically, what they would do is they would sell it to either a distributor or a retailer who would then finally mark it up and sell it to the customer. In 2008 to like 2011, there was a whole group of early, what is now known as like direct to consumer brands that wanted to cut out the middleman. And at the time, the middleman was the retailer. So instead of paying for a retailer markup, which ranges typically from anywhere from 33%, like let's say 50% on the high end, the direct to consumer brand, because they were selling it on the internet, they could pass a little bit of savings to the customer. But ultimately, when you work on a brand model, you're still incentivized to price as high as you can, and then to continue to lower prices with your manufacturers as much as possible. You make money by marking up products, right? By buying inventory and selling it at a price that's higher than what you bought it for. And I think inherently the biggest, market maker, the biggest margin of all, is always with the brand. So the idea with Italic is essentially, hey, if we abstract away the brand and have the discipline to essentially commodify all of the or turn all of the other things that brands do, such as great customer service and fast shipping and having high quality product and merchandising, but we don't actually take that margin for ourselves, but instead empower manufacturers to take that for themselves. That $16 shirt that was sold for $100 in the traditional model, and that's a conservative number, actually, it might actually end up being quite a bit higher, where the manufacturer is making anywhere from like $3 to $5 on that sale. In our world, we would still incur all of the logistical, payment processing, support, all the normal costs of doing business, but we don't take our margin, or at least nearly as much as a normal margin does, a normal brand does. But for our manufacturers, we try to double or triple their margins. So ultimately, even if we're doubling or tripling a manufacturer margin, taking a $16 shirt and turning the manufacturer margin from $4 to $8 or to $12, at the end of the day, to a customer, like, you might save quite a lot of money in that scenario. Let's say shipping was another $10, like we're talking about saving like 50% on a $100 sale, just by removing the brand. So obviously that's a very very simplistic way of kind of showing the supply chain. There's a lot of other moving parts in there, but I think that's how we frame it in a tangible way.
Yeah. And so the reason I love it is because you guys are basically, in layman's terms, you're going to the same factories, the same manufacturers that are making Gucci, All Clad, Oakley. You're going to them and saying, hey, we want a super similar, if not almost the same product, and we're going to give you more money in exchange for you working with us, and we'll basically give you a direct route to the customer. And so I imagine that this, in the early days, lived and died by your ability to go to those manufacturers and do those deals. And so I'd love for you to talk about, how did that work, right? Because in theory, the value prop it makes perfect sense for the manufacturers. You're tripling their margin and eventually giving them a direct access to the consumer. But I'm sure it wasn't as easy as that sounds. So, how
No way.
did that go? How did that go in the early days?
Yeah. One thing to quickly clarify as well, I think like we do have in-house design and development, so it's important to us that we try to strive for what we call like evergreen styles or design, but so we don't like push the bleeding edge of like what is trendy in the industry. But it is important that we respect what other brands have designed and developed over the years. I think on convincing the manufacturers, you're right that the first year in 2018, I personally met with at least 150 manufacturers in Italy, in the U.S., in China, and it was really painful. We only convinced like 2 or 3 at the end of the year to join the model, and the biggest reason why was because manufacturers are inherently extremely risk adverse, meaning they make money on cash flow, and as soon as they receive an order, they'll typically take 30 to 50% down as a deposit, and then the remaining they might even go and factor so that they get about like maybe 80 cents, 90 cents on the dollar. So they are really driven by cash flow, and the reason is like they have to go hire labor, they have to go purchase materials, they have to go purchase equipment for fulfilling these orders. So I think for a lot of these manufacturers, even to this day, it's like, hey, this model does not make sense to them. But I think where we found success was with, not younger factories, but the younger owners of legacy factories, specifically those who are maybe second or third or even fourth generation, owners, where they saw the future kind of headed towards the direction of being online. They saw the rise of a lot of these direct-to-consumer brands, and I think the irony is like to a direct to consumer brand, they might feel like they're changing the world, but to a manufacturer, it's like, I don't care if you're a direct to consumer brand or like a 100-year-old brand. It's like, to me, you're just a client who places an order and hopefully will grow. But I think ultimately, for us, like we were able to show them like, hey, if we're able to, deliver on the premise of essentially offering what we call like private label in a box, and you trust us, and we can deliver against that promise, you're going to continue doubling down on our product, on our inventory, and prioritizing our production runs because it's ultimately your capital at the table at stake. So yeah, that's kind of it took a long time. We've gotten a lot better at it over the years, and to anyone trying to do what we're doing, I would highly recommend you not do that and just try to join us. But yeah, it was a really painful experience.
Yeah, it does. To your point before, it seems like there's a lot of complexities going on under the hood, and you guys built a super smooth experience on the top. And that's the best brands do that, right? The consumer doesn't need to know what's going on behind the hood. So I wanted to dive into the membership piece a little bit and learn more about how you thought about that strategically, if that came at the very beginning or if you kind of backed into that eventually. Because for people listening, what you did is essentially align incentives, right? You created a membership program where for the customer, once you pay the membership, all the customer wants is a lot of great products that they can use that membership to get discounts for. And for you, right, you're incentivized to go out and provide more products to support the membership, so you eliminate churn, which is perfectly aligned. So, how did that come about in the strategy? And when you turned that on, was it just profound for the business model?
Yeah, I would say even back in 2018, this was like we always wanted to have some level of a membership. At the time, like I mentioned, we were able to close two or three manufacturers, so all we had day one was cashmere scarves. I think we had some eyewear and some small leather goods and bags. And ultimately, like that's even though we launched with a membership, that's not enough product to justify like paying a membership price because you're not going to buy those products every day, let alone maybe once every other month at most. So I think over the years, what we found was we really need to have sufficient product saturation before we could offer a membership, and we had to see signs where people were purchasing without us forcing them to between departments. This is a problem I think you see in a lot of venture-backed direct consumer brands where they follow the narrative of like, hey, start in one category, start in one product, and then expand from there on out. And to expand your lifetime value and expand your frequency of use. And frankly speaking, like it very rarely pans out. I've only seen it maybe at most 5% of the time of all the times that people have tried to do this. And I think for us, it's important to get that day one. We really are obsessed with the concept of a flywheel. I think you touched on this where the more members we have, the more leverage we have to convince manufacturers to join as merchants. The more merchants we have, the more products we can develop and offer to our customers, who finally kind of gives us again that leverage to convince manufacturers. So I think for us, it's the membership really was a point where in Q4 2019 we finally got sufficient conviction around our product assortment being both high quality enough as well as large enough to support cross-department purchasing to a degree where a membership would make sense. And specifically, I'd give examples where people would buy a candle and then kind of have such a good experience that they would go buy a handbag. People would buy our bedding and then have a good experience to buy our towels, so on and so forth. And I think once we saw that behavior happening organically, we really wanted to double that down with the membership experience, which today is a prerequisite to purchase. So we piloted it in April. basically the peak of COVID, and we figured this is the best stress test we could possibly give to a new membership model, where we're asking people to pay for a subscription fee upfront for a year, and the demand was sufficient enough to which we were like, hey, this is like a no-brainer. Our lifetime values and our frequencies like exploded, and I think it just drove a lot of loyalty. It also, more importantly, allowed us to drop our prices by almost like 40 to 50% across the entire product assortment. It was exactly like you said. I think the second you get into the model of making money through markups, that's when every single year you're going to lose a little bit of discipline and either raise your prices or drop your costs. And I think this is like pretty systemic to all brands. You start with the noble mission of dropping prices for consumers, and I think over time it changes to like, hey, we're just a brand. So I think for us, like, it was important to reclaim those roots, and ultimately, the alignment of incentives was very clear, where we could essentially just say like, hey, we don't need to make money on these products. In fact, a lot of our products we lose money, but that wins us loyalty with our members who trust us to deliver great product to them at a very competitive price point. And then for our manufacturers, they're still making double or triple margins. That hasn't changed from pre-membership days. So for us, the more product we move for them, the more excited they are to kind of continue to provide product for Italic as a platform. So yeah, I think that's how I'd frame it. Is it just made a lot of business sense at the time. I can't say we'll keep like the prerequisite as members only forever. I think it's just like we really wanted to prove the model out in a very intensive way. But I think it has been a pretty strong success thus far.
Yeah. I mean, there's something cool about the kind of members only piece of it. So I'm a proud member. I bought the kind of
Nice.
stainless steel cookware set, which it was a no brainer, right? Like the membership is so worth it with all the money you save. And I think that's how you set it up. A question I had, right, and I'm sure many members have similar, is talking about the product mix. So when you think about, I think what's cool about Italic is you have so many different, like you said, departments or categories, and you kind of have like the best in class couple of things across multiple categories: luggage, goggles, cookware, and you have the in-house design team. But how do you think about adding new products to the mix? Is it a factor of when you get a new manufacturer that's excited, that kind of drives it, or is it your design team and product team kind of looking on trend to see, okay, where's our portfolio maybe missing or have a gap? Talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, I think every company says this, but I think for us, we really do believe it starts with the customer and what they are specifically telling us. We run, this is another term that I think a lot of brands would use. It's like, hey, we have this community. And I think for most brands, it's like they're referring to Instagram comments or something like that. But for us, we really want to productize that community to a degree where we're constantly ingesting data to suggest to our manufacturers and to our category management team as to what we should be making next. And very specifically, the way we kind of think about this is from a qualitative level. We think about products that fit our framework of, are these historically high margin areas? Are these products that are logistically straightforward to fulfill? Are these products that are already sold and were very commonly found online? And if so, great, let's continue to the process. But on the quantitative side, we really think about it from the standpoint of like, we're constantly ingesting data. So if we look at data that tells us like, hey, we're missing this product, and if we introduce it, it'll improve our ability to incrementally convert net new customers as members, that's a win for us. And we should look at the low-hanging fruit in categories in terms of what people are saying we're missing before they can join. And then on the flip side, for people who are already members, I know you've probably gotten this survey plenty of times where we ask like, hey, what are things that we're missing as a membership that would make the membership better for you? And more often than not, for those are products that are like variants of existing products or kind of going deeper in categories. So to give you an example, in bedding, it could be different materials, it could be different colors. In apparel, it could be different like styles or cuts. Whereas for net new members, what we more often see than not is like, hey, I want you to make this category, and once you have this, like, then we'll join. So that's kind of how we think about it. I have to say, it's very much a mix of art and science. We always have to be. We know that our customers can't tell us everything, and we have to kind of proactively look around corners for them to find product ideas or categories that we think that would fit very well with what they're looking for. And typically that's for, like I said, people who aren't members today. But then on the flip side, for people who are members, it's really all about retention in that regard. So are we providing a good enough service? And most importantly, are we providing great products at a great price point to keep you on for a member as years. So we're not there yet. I mean, we have a long ways to go in terms of where I think we ultimately will look as a product assortment, but that's how we view it as a team.
Yeah, I love that. One of the things that, like it or not, that listeners love about the show is when we dive into like things that aren't working. Like if you pull back the curtain, where had you allocated time or a small bet here and there across, product growth, hiring that just didn't work out or hasn't worked out. And I think that humility from founders is really, really attractive when people listen. So when you think about the journey so far, what are some of those things that, either you wish you could have done differently or just, you took a swing, it didn't work and you moved on?
I feel like everything. I could say so many things right now. I think let me think. I think one area that was okay. Two big misses. One, from an early point, we had originally not spent a lot of time in design and development of our own products, and instead we would kind of trust what manufacturers had as private label products and basically take those and onboard them to the site like immediately. And we thought like, hey, because it's from the same factory as XYZ, like customers should trust it. And what we found out was like customers do like that. They like the quality, but the design sucked. So it's not to say it sucked, but it could have been much more on trend or much more modern in taste. For example, in the case of let's say handbags. So for that entire franchise and department, we really had to kind of take a step back and like find a way to sell through everything we had while simultaneously developing a whole new line from scratch and shipping it like in less than 4 to 5 months, which in retail land is like very, very fast. So I think that was one area where it was one where I think we could have avoided if we more proactively had listened to our customers from an early point in time. A second one I would say is probably over investing in technology and tooling and think like solving problems that like didn't exist yet, versus like working on problems that were very apparent from day one, but like were the hard problems that you kind of like shy away from. So to give you a tangible example, we had a whole engineering team essentially solely devoted to building at the time what we called our admin center, where we had a number of tools that we wanted to build for our manufacturers to communicate to our category managers who at the time were buyers. And the realization was like, hey, this is so unnecessary. Like we can do this on email and WeChat, right? Like we are reinventing the horse. Like, and we ever had like upper ass so far that it's like there's really no point we should have to doing that day one. That's something that we should have been doing. Like if we were 100-person or 200 or a couple 100-person team doing like hundreds of millions, not like a pre-launch startup. So there were a lot of learning lessons over the years. I think I gave you two. Even for I think personnel and team, like there's a whole bunch there that I think like the older you get, the more you realize like everything's gray area and everything. There's no like all the advice you're given. It's like sometimes applicable, sometimes not. But yeah, we've made so many mistakes, but I think we're all the stronger for it.
Yeah, well, you definitely can't tell when you look at the product quality. It looks super sharp. So
Thank you.
You guys are on the right track.
Appreciate that. Thanks.
Yeah, of course. All right, so last question in this section is we ask this to every guest. It's called the Startup Manifesto. So if you had to write a startup manifesto with 5 of the most important key lessons or pitfalls to avoid when starting out, what would they be?
Oh man. I think that the times have changed a lot for being a founder. I think like when I started at least, and this wasn't all that many years ago, like there were a lot of commonly held heuristics that, more often than not, it comes from the investor landscape that, founders listen to investors, right? And that's changed as well. But generally speaking, it was like back in 2014 and 2015, it was, all the big exits are in consumer. B2B is like super safe. And then like engineering and product is all that matters. Like you need a technical team, you need co-founders. Like all those are true in certain regards. But I think and I did YC, I did Teal. Like I did a lot of these like programs that I think have taught me more to be less like follow less heuristics. There are very few pieces of advice that are like universally applicable, and what works for other companies like more often than not will not work for yours. So whatever I say, like I would highly recommend to anyone listening, like don't try to copy and instead like follow first principles, mentality of figuring it out for yourself and learn rapidly. So I think that's number one is ignore most advice, even if that's to your own detriment in the early days. Secondly, is I think it really helps. It really helps to younger founders or first-time founders, or founders who have having a hard time raising, for example, or even those who don't like. I think it's really helpful. I don't like the word mentor, but and frankly speaking, I can't say I have like, oh, I have a formal mentor or anything, but I do think it's helpful to find peers who are a couple years ahead of you, who are willing to be go to bat for you and be your champion. This was super helpful when it comes to raising money. Like there's a lot of bad advice online around this, and I think there's a lot of like things that people say online that they don't realize like can really affect how people try to raise. And I think like if you have a good friend who's done this, or at least find someone or get connected to someone who's really willing to put in the work for you, whether that's an angel or an advisor, whatever it is, I think that's something that would have saved me a lot of time and heartache over the years, quite frankly. I think third is, a lot of the, I hate to say it, but like a lot of the fluffy BS stuff that like as a younger founder you think is like completely baloney, like values, mission, vision. Yeah, that stuff does matter a lot. Like it actually is very real, and the longer you put it off and you don't institutionalize it as a culture, the more it's out of your control later on. So you can't like retroactively fix culture, or if you do, it's extremely hard. So I think that's and culture isn't like so I guess my advice here is like, hey, be very intentional and set culture from an earlier point in time in your company history. Don't like let it be. Obviously, like who you bring on will set the culture and dictate like who the next person you bring on is. But I think who you bring on is also a function of what your values are. So in that regard, culture isn't like these nebulous terms of like fairness and integrity and transparency. Like everyone says that, right? Instead, I think it's more, operating principles of like, hey, do executives set up furniture? Do you call out the CEO in front of the rest of the team? Do I ask for a raise today versus later? And I think like, a lot of, those questions are really like, they are frankly black and white. You can't like half go in the middle of the spectrum there with those questions. And I think like the sooner you answer those for yourself as what you want in your company, the better off you are. I put that off a number of times in both of our companies, and I think like that's something that we really regret, and frankly had to let go of people because they didn't match what I frankly like personally should have done much sooner. And I take that as my own kind of big learning lesson. I think fourth, I would say is I think you have to be very deliberate about like what you're trying to achieve with the business, and intentional, and like you should be as direct as possible about this. I learned this lesson with my first company, where like we were building the startup for the sake of building a startup, and ultimately that is probably the worst reason to build a startup possible, because like the first couple of years are great, but man, when you're trying to recruit that like 50th person and you're talking about the mission that you like don't care about, like, or have no passion about, yeah, it's really hard, and it really drains on you mentally and emotionally. So I would be I recommend anyone like be very deliberate about what you're doing this for. If it's for money, by the way, that's not a bad thing at all. Like you should own that and make that like part of your MO. Like, hey, we're going for an exit and trying to make a lot of money here. There's nothing wrong with that. Where am I? Was that four? Okay,
That
I
was
guess
four,
one more,
yeah.
right? All right. Lastly, I would say, there's a lot of like, I think the most important thing I would say is like, it really has to do with colleagues and investors. You don't have to work with people you don't want to. And I guess what I mean by that is like a lot of people. If I were to give myself advice early on, I'd be like, hey, you have the choice to hire these people or take their money. It's not like you need their money, and it's not like you need their help. I think oftentimes we chase like logos or resumes that look nice, but the people themselves aren't actually like that great to work with. It's not to say like logos and resumes and experience doesn't matter. It really, really does. But I think what's more is like you could have the best growth in the world. Your company could be exploding. You could have the best perks, but like if you have colleagues you're not enjoying, spending time with, like the work still sucks. So I think ultimately it's you want to surround yourself with people professionally, since that's where you spend most of your life, actually, at least during the day, is with people whom you're legitimately excited to be around. So, and that goes for both employees, co-founders, advisors, and investors, and also I think like extends truly to personal life as well. So, um, yeah, those are just what comes up to mind. I hope that was helpful.
No, that was very impressive, top of mind. That was a great
Thanks.
that was a great list. Very, very transparent. And I think, sometimes to your point on one of those there, which is, like the fluff, like the mission vision, the things you think are fluff that are really important. I would say the way a lot of founders frame their answer to this question, like they almost use media speak. And I really felt like what you just shared there was
Yeah, that's a good way
transparent.
to put it.
Yeah.
That's a yeah, yeah. That's there's a lot of corporate. It's like you're a startup and you're a founder of like a 5-person team. There's like literally no reason to and say oh man, like 90%. Oh man, I yeah, that's a really good way to put it. Media speak.
So that was a great answer. And I, like I said, I think that list was super transparent. A few questions that I wanted to ask you in kind of this third section around kind of the founder, I call it, which is like more personal to you. So one of them is around investing. I find it fascinating. Most founders do angel invest a little bit on the side, and I find it fascinating to break in or dive into, what your thesis is, or at least the framework that you use when you evaluate different other companies. I'm sure there's some extent where you've got friends and you always back your friends because you never want to see them succeed on a unicorn and not be a part of it. But then there's probably a bunch of others, and you have a great portfolio: Notion, Stir, Pipe, Alloy, and a bunch of others. So you want to just talk about what you look for when you evaluate deals to invest in?
Yeah, well, I gotta be honest, you kind of nailed my thesis there. Was I had missed so many great companies because they were friends, and I just didn't have the money at the time. Or I mean, it's not that I didn't have the money. I just like legitimately was so scared about parting ways with money, a couple of years ago that I missed, and like now it's all about regret. It's like, oh man, I really screwed up there. 5-6 years ago, I could have gotten all these great companies, like because I know them personally, and now I'm trying to like avoid that going forward. But no, I mean, taking one step back, I'd say it's also funny because I think like the investor outlook on founders investing has changed a lot as well, and I think partially this is because, frankly, like investors have lost control to a degree where it used to be like whatever the investor said is what goes, and nowadays it's like, well, there's a lot of investors out there, and you kind of get to pick and choose as a founder like whom you want to work with, and reputations, today are more transparent than they ever have been before. So. I think nowadays it's like founders actually have the ability to angel invest. Whereas like if you ask the same question 5-6 years ago, it's like I'd be willing to bet like at least 50% of people who would respond be like, oh, I don't angel invest. Like I'm focused on my company like 100%, and that is true. I am like generally speaking 100% focused on the company. I think for me, I'd say there's probably two big areas. One is in I would say like anything that I'm not doing, but I think is interesting. And I think those, you named a couple like I'm not a creator, but I invested in Stir because I like, the founder's awesome. We've been friends. And I think it's like a very obviously cool idea. And it's so far removed from what I do that I was like, oh, this is like a very compelling reason to invest. And in other cases, it's just the second reason is just like, hey, I would have used the product or I use the product today and I really like what they do. So that's in the case of like Junip for, product reviews. For Pipe, we used them for Fountain. We were one of the first clients. Ramp, we use them for credit cards, like so on and so forth. And they were just like, hey, like I use them day to day. I love the product. I'd love to just like put in a tiny founder check if you'd have me. And it's I think the way I frame it is like, hey, it never hurts to have another founder on board. If anything, like I'm just a silent member on the cap table. So that's the way I'd frame like investing. It's really like a side hobby. It's not like something I pursue actively, and it's one where all of the deal flow just comes from I think having friends who are nice enough to let me in, and that's it.
Yeah, that's awesome. So another project that you're working on, which I mean, you must be a busy guy for sure, is Not Pot, right? And so your significant other, Katie, is running that full time, I think. But I'd love for you to just talk about, you know, how did that idea come about? And are there any interesting lessons that you've learned from the Not Pot operation that you've applied to Italic or anywhere else in your life?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, first of all, working with your significant other is very, very challenging early on. I don't know if you've ever tried it, but oh man, it takes a toll on your personal relationship for sure. And I think, if anything, the biggest takeaway is just like, how do you manage a professional relationship while also being like, essentially with the other person 24/7. So I think that's, if anything, that's like my biggest personal takeaway. But I think, um, there's a lot of things that we took away from NotPod. I mean, NotPod, just for those who don't aren't aware, I say it's like an American wellness brand, and I don't say CBD because I feel like it gives off a sketchy impression. But no, it's a really fun brand. Every month we also pay for we donate money from profits to pay for someone's bail as well, and that was something we've done from day one back in like 2017. So I think it was just one where, like, I was working on Fountain at the time. It was one where I think Katie and I wanted to do something, and this is back when CBD was still in kind of gray area, and we figured like, hey, why not like try this ingredient out? At the time, we were selling coconut butters with like really interesting ingredients mixed together, and that one just like took off like crazy. So all things considered, we were relatively early to CBD. We were relatively I think if you go to the site notpot.com, it's like a really really fun, super like heavily branded. It's like the complete opposite of Italic, which is like the anti-brand, where brand is everything, and the main reason why I think people purchase it is like they believe in the brand, they like how it looks, they like how it the mission, and I think we've taken a lot from that for Italic. I think both from a team structure point of view, as well as a like having a brand be like, anyone can say they don't, like, for us, we don't say we are a brand. We believe like it's more of a technology business, and that's how we really view the company. But at the end of the day, of course, like to a consumer, yeah, it's a brand. We look like a brand, we speak like a brand, we are a brand, right? So I think really embracing that was important. I think from an operating point of view as well, Nowpod has been bootstrapped from day one. The only money we've ever raised was just from myself, Katie, and for, kind of our parents, and I think it really instilled like a deep like operating philosophy of like, hey, we need to generate cash flow and like run the business off of that. I can't say it's like been like all rosy because of that. There were plenty of times where we're like, hey, I wish we raised, but I think ultimately it instills a level of like frugality in how you operate. A lot of these direct to consumer brands, they'll raise a ton of money as if they were a tech company, and once they realize, hey, they're really not, you kind of run into a brick wall of like, okay, how do I scale now? And you can open stores, you can do podcast ads, you can do TV ads, and I'm sure a lot of people do that successfully. But I think for Notpod, it's like, hey, we want to run this business like in this way, and I think it taught a lot of lessons on how to run Italic as well. So yeah, it's a really cool company. You should check it out.
Yeah, it's a great crossover opportunity. I love the branding. To your point on the
Thank you.
site, it just as soon as you as soon as you type it into the URL, it just smacks you in the face like the entire aesthetic, and I love it. It's super powerful.
Thanks. Yeah, we're pretty proud of the branding, and we actually like just became partners at the Japanese anime studio that we've been using for a long time. That was really hard to find, by the way. So if anyone is interested in anime production, we're also available for work.
Yeah, that's great. All right, one question until we get to the brainstorm, and then I know we got to get you out of here around wellness. So, my personal North Star has always been wellness and this concept of the health stack, where fitness, nutrition, mindfulness, sleep. I think it all works in concert together, and when you've got those things firing on all cylinders, it really creates a compounding effect. And so I'd love to hear just from you. I mean, you've got an American wellness brand already in the family, but how do you think about wellness? And do you have any, set routines or practices across any of those categories that you stick to?
I could give you the feel good answer, the true answer, and the feel good answer is like, I feel like I'm in a good spot. I'm pretty happy with my work. Like, I'm very fulfilled by what I do, and loving, supportive relationship, and like all those things. But in reality and in practice, man, it's tough. Like, it's hard. I think like when you run a company, when you're a founder, like it's hard to detach yourself from that company. And I know people say like, hey, you are not your company, you're not like your job, like whatever it is. But in reality, like it's a big part of your identity, right? Like that's how people, whenever you meet someone, it's like, hey, what do you do? Whenever someone asks how you're doing, like they're going to inevitably ask how your company's doing, if they know you at least. And I think it's hard to disassociate that. And what that results in is like, let's say I do try to start like a workout routine. Like, what do I think about when I'm like in the gym? I'm thinking about work. What am I thinking about? I'm technically on like vacation right now. Like, what am I thinking about on vacation? Like ideas so that when I get back in work, I can like share them with the team. So it's I think that's probably the hardest thing in terms of like wellness is just like distancing, creating space for yourself to have room outside of work. But the hard part is like work. That's also if you have a good job or you're excited about it, like that's what you think about 24/7. So I don't know. The true answer is like I don't have strong habits. I don't have good routines. Like I live in Park City, so try to go hit the mountain once in a while and get a couple runs down the mountain in. But aside from that, I mean, COVID did a number on me. Now that I'm indoors all day, I'm just glued to a computer. So I'm trying to figure that out. So if you have any tips, I'm all ears.
Yeah, no, there's a lot of health practices that people are gonna have to unwind from the last 12 months of just 16 hours on
Yeah,
the screen.
right.
Yeah, at least you're getting that fresh mountain air though. That's gotta count for something.
Yes, I have to say the air quality has been nice, and also the elevation. It forces your heart to work a little harder.
Yeah, totally. All right, so last section here, and we can just take it however you want. And it's the brain, so it's the My First Million inspired brainstorm. So I think the biggest thing that I love to get in with founders is if Italic or NotPod didn't exist today, and let's say you couldn't tackle that exact same space, what's one idea or one other business that really interests you that you would go after as an operator?
Um, Man, I feel like I should have prepared for this. I think it depends. I think if you were first starting out, if let's say you were like a third time founder and you were like, I'm not saying this is me, but let's say you're like a third time founder and you're like super successful, investors are throwing money at you. Like, I think what I would suggest there is very different than what I would suggest in to a first time founder who doesn't have that reputation or like that resume and just like wants to get going. Um, and I think to the latter, the easiest recommendation I would give there is like if you want to do like a lifestyle business or one where you want to run a side hobby until you like generate enough cash flow to it to either raise money or go out on your own and bootstrap it. I think like I think that if you are tech, technically savvy, I think one of the best opportunities nowadays is to build small verticalized software for niche industries. And I think one example of that is like building scheduling software for like pool maintenance or building or the same thing for like lawn mowing or what or I give you a lot of examples there, but I think like if you go down the route of like trying to generate cash flow from software, I think that's a really great place to be operating in. And I think about that a lot. I think if you're trying to like settle down and have a good lifestyle, Katie and I have thought about a lot of like we lived in China for a year when we were starting in Italic, and like there are all these really really cool things over in Asia that don't exist in the States today. One example is like they have these chains of like fruit stores, which if you think about it, it's like a very obvious idea. Just think of like a really nice like Sweet Green branded like fruit store, and I think like the margins are high, like you can command a lot of loyalty there, high frequency use case. And I think that could be really interesting. And I think that's one like, hey, if I get later on in life and I'm bored, like that could be really interesting to take on. I think from a large scale like venture, you could go the deep tech route. I'm just spitballing here. If you want to pause me at any point, I think I've been thinking about this. I think I was listening to one guy I look up to a lot is Ryan Peterson from Flexport, and I think like what they've built is really cool from a freight kind of brokerage model where they made booking freight. It's not to say they made it easier, but I think they've digitized the experience a lot. I think there's a lot of opportunity for similar models in other areas of the supply chain. So, I think I mentioned on the My First Millions podcast where I think cold chain logistics right now is like a very obviously like that's a deep supply chain model. Like you have to be into that type of stuff if you want to do this, or you just want to make money. But that's a great place to be working right now. I think if you wanted to do like some crazy stuff, I think like space right now people are finally investing in, which is crazy. But I think more importantly, I think like on the supply chain side, there's a lot of cross-border services. I mean, I think about this from an Italic standpoint all the time. We have to build a lot of our tooling, from scratch simply because the cross-border fulfillment experience is like so poor. And this is actually, I mean, this is how Apple fulfills like MacBooks to you. They like produce it in China. They will ship it from China to you, as opposed to going through a warehouse. And that bypasses duties and tariffs, which is great. But more importantly, it allows them to keep like very small inventories, and also like have similar fulfillment times. And you're willing to wait like 7 to 10 days. So I think there's a lot of like interesting things on the cross-border fulfillment side that Italic might actually dive into one day. I don't know. I have a lot of things. I could pull up a list if you wanted to, but I want to be, if there was anything there that was interesting, I could dive in.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of it makes sense. Right, the two big things, the verticalized software. I think I've heard you mention that before, and some other people have talked about that. And it's just an endless amount of possibilities because there's so
Totally.
many niches that are so uh, analog, like they're not digitized at all. None of the pieces of it are digitized. So if you just tackle one for one niche, I think what people forget is how if you scale that across the U.S., there's so many like you talked about lawn care. There are so many small
Yeah.
1 to 10
Right.
person lawn care companies that would just die to have some of this software. And so you really don't need to build $1 billion business in some of these niche software categories to really make a difference. So that one resonated for sure.
Yeah, I think another thing is, I think in the past, a lot of the whole like there was a stigma with anything in China, right? Like, it's like, oh, they're just going to copy like whatever you do. But now, if you look there, I mean, not many founders are doing this, which is kind of crazy to me. But they have some like really, really interesting like business models that I've never seen in the States. Yeah, I mean, the most like the hottest of which right now is like community group buying, where like you have these, moms and these like these communities that will basically like buy groceries in mass, for the entire community and like get a discount that way. I think like the
Like
whole
Pinduoduo.
kind of, yeah, Pinduoduo has like done that to a degree. There's like that, I think Pinduoduo is like group buying. They were like group buying from in the past 5 years, and then like in the past 2 years or so, there was like this new community group buying, which is a lot more intense, like where someone physically has to like go and kind of deliver all the remaining packages to the community. That's like one example. There's a lot more. Um, I think like one other thing. I think, sorry, I pulled up my I pulled up the idea list. Um, Convenience. Did I talk about the convenience store roll up? I think I did. Uh, Zoodle shop. I think like doing a sweet green type of model again with like keto paleo friendly noodles, in like a quick service restaurant style would be really interesting. And I think you could scale that actually. I think MLMs again have a really bad reputation, and mostly for a good reason. But I think the sales model itself actually has a lot of legs where if you can get, and I don't think it has to be nefarious where you have to sell like crappy products, but I think like there is a way to deploy that, whether that's in selling software. I mean, you have this in like inside sales, right? Where there's like a lot of commission layers in sales teams. I think there could be interesting way. I think there's actually a lot of interesting software that could be built there, where it could be applied to a more general use case as opposed to like sketchy products. Um, Ordering via QR codes, like I think but someone's doing this. I forgot who it was, but right now like QR codes are just menus in China. Like they're menus, point of sale, cash collect. It's like an end-to-end kind of restaurant solution. You don't even need waiters in most Chinese restaurants. Um, yeah, I'll pause there. I know we're kind of getting at time, but there's a lot. There's a lot.
Yeah, I'm sure we could riff on that for another hour. But I
Yeah.
definitely want to be conscious of your time. And so, before I let you go, I just want to acknowledge you for a second. I'm obviously hosting, but I'm a huge fan of you and the brand, as I said. And I think, what sticks out most among so many things is I love talking to founders that create a solve for underrepresented parties. And I think what you did with Italic is not only provide a voice and, of course, more margin in their pocket for the manufacturers. But you've also kind of democratized access to luxury for so many consumers that just can't afford the crazy prices that the name brands were charging. And so, you've got two different parties there that are quote unquote underrepresented that you're solving for. And I think that's super amazing. And I just want to thank you again for coming on. Again, I'll be a huge fan and I'll support you guys as much as I can moving forward.
Thank you. I actually, this is a good time to bring it up because I forgot to mention earlier. My team did make a little code for this show. So if anyone wanted to try out Italic, you can go to italic.com/founder, and I think it's like 30% off. So whatever, I'm not sure exactly what they made, but it's there if you want to try it out. And yeah, thanks so much for having me. I really appreciate that and what you do here. So thanks for the opportunity.
Of course. Jeremy Kai, co-founder and CEO of Italic. Thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thank you for having me.